So Metal Gear's kind of weird, huh? No, I mean that in the best way. I've honestly never played anything like it before. It has some of the most unique designs I've ever seen and go against nearly every modern day design convention for better or for worse. And there are many reasons this game turned out so odd to begin with, and a lot of that is due to the time it was released. First off, because Metal Gear Solid is a self-proclaimed tactical espionage action game, it's important to consider that even though stealth games are a dime a dozen these days, with their systems even being haphazardly shoehorned into nearly all action games just because, back in 1998, stealth as a genre barely even existed, and this year happened to be a major turning point for the genre, with both Thief the Dark Project and Metal Gear Solid releasing within 3 months of each other. But up until their releases, the design language for what a stealth game should be hadn't been solidified yet, until Solid Snake slithered out of the darkness to solidify stealth into what we know it as today. We have all the usual trappings here, a unified goal to stay undetected with patrolling guards, armed surveillance cameras and dastardly traps designed to hinder Snake in his ability to venture deeper into Shadow Moses Island. And in a lot of modern stealth games, and even in the aforementioned Thief, direct engagement with combat is made as awkward as possible to give consequences for being detected and encourage the correct way of progressing through its game's stealth encounters. But that's not the case here with Metal Gear. It doesn't instantly kill the player the moment they're spotted or dare to try something contradictory to the designer's intent. Quite the opposite, in fact. It litters the environment with an abundance of tools to help the player overcome its challenges. For example, the classic moving laser traps barring your path. Do you hunt for the thermal goggles or use cigarette smoke to guide the way? You have that freedom, but you just have to deal with the fallout of your decisions if you mess up. In today's language, Metal Gear Solid could actually be considered more of an immersive sim than it is a stealth game. Well, yeah, if we're crawling through vents, it must be an immersive sim, right? Its world demands your attention, not just in its stealth encounters and punishment for mismanagement of such, but also with how the user interface is set up. For example, you cannot interact with locked doors unless you have the key item equipped, and this seems small, but it completely alters how players need to approach basic interactions with the game. This juggling act of constantly switching between healing items, body armor, keycards, drugs, and weapons keeps what would have been simple enemy patrols fresh because of the friction the user interface facilitates and the way that encourages player planning. There's also this sense of permanence to the world with how the player and its NPCs interact with it. For example, Snake leaves footprints in the snow which can alert guards to his presence as they patrol, and walking in a puddle will produce an audible pitter-patter that also grabs their attention. All of this was unheard of for the time and further forces players to pay close attention to the world's details. Well, yeah, that's a great question. With all of this attention to minute details, why do the guards' bodies disappear when they die? A tenet of stealth design in the modern era is the concealment and detection of incapacitated foes and how that dynamically alters the pre-established enemy threats and their routes. But that's not done here. Well, I think a lot of that comes from a direct result of the limitations of the PlayStation itself. The more I've delved into these episodes on the PS1 era, the clearer it's become how incredibly restricting it was to develop for that console. With only 2 megabytes of main RAM, 1 megabyte of VRAM, and 512 kilobytes of audio RAM, this drastically limits the developers on the details they could imbue their world with, not just visually, but also in depth and quantity. So developers had to get creative in how to counter these limitations. When we look at Metal Gear Solid, we can see the incredible amount of details to its environments compared to other games of the era, where other titles would have to narratively manufacture reasons for dense fog just to reduce draw distances to save on resources. Here's Metal Gear Solid coming out before Silent Hill, letting players tactically peer into rooms via its first-person mode, which in other games would remain unloaded just to save on memory. How is this even possible? Well, Kojima Productions went to great lengths to develop custom proprietary KMD files to compress and save specific map layouts, environmental geometry, collision and mesh data, allowing them to pack more into the game in a smaller file format. But due to the limited memory on the PS1, all of the data for each of the area's item locations, pre-programmed guard patrols, and even unlockable doors needed to revert back to their original state, as the game didn't have a way to maintain unintended change to the world within its memory. Hence why, when you return to a location, it's loaded back to its original state, guards, items and all. And this is also why the guards themselves disappear on death. but they keep the footprints. Well, yeah, footprints are decals applied to the floor based on Snake's walk cycle, and decals themselves are super cheap to render, and they can be conveniently melted away on room transitions. Guards, on the other hand, are a completely different story. Because they can be incapacitated practically anywhere on the map, the game would have to track the location of that body with all of its mesh data at all times. It's purely a resource issue, not a programming one. For instance, it would be easy to transition a patrolling guard between its three states of patrolling, investigating, or alert if they encountered a body along its patrol path. They already do this if they encounter footprint decals, but the issue is having the spontaneous memory usage of a guard's body remaining in memory. Now multiply that with how many guards the game allows you to kill, the bloat would be unimaginable. Having bodies disappear was a necessity because of how limiting the PS1 was. But that being said, just like with anything artistic, limitations are what breed creativity, and that can be seen clearly via the game's art direction. So I love low poly PlayStation art. The crunch of it all, it is sickeningly beautiful to me, but it's all born out of necessity, because when all things are considered and you have a scene that is fully textured and lit, PlayStation 1 developers had a budget of around 3,000 to 9,000 polygons per frame to render. To put that into perspective, Nathan Drake from Uncharted: A Thief's End from a decade ago had a polygon count of roughly 90,000 for his player model. Metal Gear Solid had 10% of that for the entire scene. Now, you can get away with simplified hard surface environment models that use textures to create depth where there is none in the model itself, but it presents a larger problem with the character models. For example, to maintain that crisp 30 FPS, Solid Snake's model sits at a respectable 644 polygons, which is not a lot of real estate to work with, so tricks were employed, such as completely detaching the arms and hiding them under the shoulder pads of his jacket, allowing for greater range of movement without adding complex topology needed to realistically attach and bend the arms. You can see this in all of its naked glory with Meryl's arms. Yeah, it is true that she probably has more polygons in her ass than she does her shoulders, but it's plot relevant, alright? Anyway, this same detachment can also be seen with the characters' heads to allow them to move freely without deforming the neck at all. Oh, and while we're here, let's look at Snake's gorgeous face. Due to the PS1 limitations, textures could only reach a maximum size of 256 by 256, which was mostly reserved for larger environment models. Characters' face and body models needed to utilize canvases as small as 32 by 32, so the artists at Kojima Productions had to do a lot of work with shadow outlining with Snake's eyes, nose, and mouth to imply depth on this tiny canvas, and you can see this across nearly all of the in-game models, but I honestly think it gives everyone this mysterious charm. God, I just love low poly art so much. To further account for this lack of texture detail, Metal Gear Solid heavily employs a technique called dithering to add depth to its textures. Dithering is when a pattern is applied between two colors to give the illusion of a third color, and this can be baked directly into the textures themselves, or in Metal Gear's case, via a filter applied across the entire screen as a catch-all, and this is called Bayer dithering. This looks absolutely incredible and adds so much depth, but if you're playing on original hardware but not coupling that with a CRT TV, these layers are extremely noticeable, and that's not on the game whatsoever. These titles were made to be played on CRT TVs, and the dithering meshes beautifully in conjunction with proper scan lines and this texture blending that happens at lower resolutions. But playing on modern monitors can also affect gameplay too. You know that really cool laser puzzle I mentioned earlier with the cigarette smoke? Well, on stream, because I was playing at a crisp 720p and 16 by 9, I could just see the faint outline of the lasers and just one-tap the entire challenge, as Kojima Productions intended, I'm sure. Huh? What's up with the water? That's a bit of a broad question, don't you think? Oh, you mean the vertex snapping? Well, so 3D models are made up of polygons, and each polygon is made up of a set of vertices. Think of them like the corners of a shape. Now, an interesting thing about the PS1 is that it would track the positions of all of these vertices in the game, and as the camera moved, it would decide where to place them. But the limitations of the PS1 meant that it couldn't calculate floating point numbers and had to resolve all of these calculations on whole numbers. For example, if you move in-game, the models in the background move as well, and some of the models' vertices may land on floating coordinates, let's say 1.6. The console would then have to either round up or down to a whole integer, like 1 or 2. So because of this, certain textures in the environment would appear to pop as they were rounded up or down, creating this distinct PS1 vertex wobble effect as vertices settled into their positions. And I actually think in some instances this actually adds to the scene's depth. All of these artistic limitations considered, I was honestly blown away by just how good this game looked for 1998. But what really stood out for me was its voice acting. As much as I adore the game's cinematic camera work, the voice acting is doing so much heavy lifting when it comes to its characterization, which was relatively rare for the time. In all the games, you see a lot of miming going on with flailing arms and dramatic movements to convey emotions, but here, as we mentioned before, the heads of each character is detached from their neck. So in most of its dialogue scenes, they just wobble their head from side to side and let the voice acting just speak for itself, and as much as I'll never be able to unsee that, it completely works and cuts down on the animations needed. Throughout the entire game, it's obvious that the developers were constantly looking at all of the tools at their disposal to tell a more compelling story while also cutting down on resources used. For example, the player is frequently going to be looking at the map, so it's then used as a narrative delivery tool in conjunction with sound effects to effectively tell the story of Meryl's jail escape with no animations needed whatsoever. These developers were just constantly thinking outside of the box, and that's one of the game's strongest aspects, but it's easy to think outside of the box when you've never even seen the inside of it. I've spoken a lot on this show about cargo cult thinking, or how mindlessly following previous design trends can actively stagnate the industry. But weirdly enough, I think Kojima might be basically immune to this because, as he stated himself, he only plays around one game a year and prefers movies or books. So when he and his team come up with an interesting design concept during development, instead of defaulting to what has worked in previous games, they are naturally forced to think outside of that box because they've never seen the inside of it. That's how we get weird stuff like checking the back of the box for the codec frequencies, or packing yourself into boxes in the back of a van as a mode of fast travel, or getting a wolf pup to piss on a box to make wolves love you. Back it up, puppy. The greatest example of how Metal Gear Solid's weird ideas can affect you is with its torture scene, repeatedly requiring you to mash buttons at an insane pace to withstand the torture multiple times, with Revolver Ocelot remarking how long ago your last save was and how terrible it would be for you to replay all of that again. When I died to this repeatedly, the game's torture genuinely worked on me. I wanted to give up, but my chat told me about some ancient spoon tech to overcome this. This means that the game's torture worked and caused me to resort to culinary shenanigans to overcome it. That is the closest I think I'm ever going to get to pure ecstasy. But one of the problems with being so odd is, how is the average player going to figure all of this out? Well, they resolve that by just getting weirder. Because they use diegetic codec calls from NPCs to non-diegetically hint or outright tell Snake how to interact with the controls of the game that we ourselves are controlling to control Snake. My modern design break just snapped in half. You can't do that. Pick a lane, mate. Diegetic or non-diegetic teaching. But as odd as this is, you get into this rhythm of calling the codec if you're ever stuck, and this is usually accompanied by conversations that dramatically add to the story at hand while also teaching you how to progress. It is a win-win. But I will say that sometimes these calls can get a tad annoying when they're not optional. I'll have calls come up directly in the middle of time-sensitive life or death situations.
Snake, are you okay?
Yeah, I'm getting shot at, mate. Now's not the fucking time. And these kinds of interruptions are most prevalent in boss fights because, apart from a select few, this is where the game gets its most video gamey. Now, let's be frank for a minute. Some of these bosses are unbelievably memorable and all have incredible narratives attached to them, but mechanically, they seem like a bit of a step back from the player-driven variety of the moment-to-moment gameplay. For example, the amazing elevator is too heavy, 4 invis dudes jumping your surprise fight is an amazing narrative moment, and the developers allow you to handle it however you want. I, for one, stunned them and planted C4 at their feet. But jumping back to the boss directly before this, your only option is to shoot Liquid's helicopter with this Stinger launcher, and that's it. Now, there are 100% places where this makes sense narratively, like with the mano-a-mano fight with Grey Fox. I absolutely adore that, but in simpler fights, it can become forcibly formulaic and draw attention to how little damage you're doing. Now, with what I'm about to say, I want to be extremely clear that I adore the Psycho Mantis fight. It's reading the memory card section and the way it requires the player to creatively consider the function of the controller and hints at that through its little rumble on the floor gag. This is iconic behavior and I would not change anything about it. However, I think it's odd that once the player has solved this kind of crazy puzzle of breaking Psycho Mantis' psychic link to Snake, there is still an incredibly slow boss fight where he can hit you for 1/3 of your health, but your attacks tickle him. I don't think this subsequent fight adds anything to the encounter, and if anything, takes away from the narrative moment that follows it. The interesting part of the fight, the psychic puzzle, is already done, and it's just a slog to get through the rest, especially if you die during it and you have to repeat it for the next half an hour. I made an entire episode on how health bars and health totals can drastically alter how your game feels, and I honestly think some of these bosses are great examples of how having lower health totals might better serve the narrative they're trying to tell. And this is especially odd because the game has proven that they alter the health total of its bosses to better represent their personal strength. Like with Sniper Wolf, she takes increased damage from the sniper rifle shots. This makes sense, but they choose to give Psycho Mantis, this BDSM demon, a health total comparable to a literal tank. And no, I don't think this is strictly because they want longer and more frequent boss fights for gameplay's sakes. They narratively introduce 6 bosses in the opening of this game and have Decoy Octopus die directly in front of a player simply to have a cool narrative moment. This is extremely ballsy and memorable with no fight whatsoever. The part people lovingly remember about Psycho Mantis is not the actual fight, but the innovative puzzle beforehand. But interestingly enough, even while I was voicing all of these criticisms live, a viewer chimed in and told me to check out the Twin Snakes remake for Metal Gear Solid on the GameCube, and now I can see why, because nearly everything I criticized and assumed to be a PS1 limitation in MGS was addressed and altered in Twin Snakes. Enemy corpses disappearing, having alternate ways to engage with boss fights and lowering their health totals, leading me to believe that these were all indeed limitations in hardware and that the developers learned from their own mistakes, which are inevitable when you're attempting to break new ground in a genre that doesn't even exist. Seeing the rest of the industry rushing to get inside of a box and deciding, nah, that's not for us, mate, takes a lot of courage, and I'm glad they did this because it led to one of the most memorable experiences I've ever had playing a game, so thank you all for voting for this. And on that note, the next vote for the never before played retro design delve is going to take place tomorrow on the 26th of May at 7 PM EST over on my Twitch channel. It will be between Final Fantasy IX or Majora's Mask, and you get to decide. So I hope to see you all there, my lovelies, and I'll see you in the next one.